Hi, everyone, and welcome to the September edition of our Spark Session webinar broadcast. My name is Lasse Lund, and I am the Program Director at Spark Freedom. Joining me on this broadcast is my coworker, Sarah Johnson. She is the Marketing Director for Spark Freedom, and she will serve as your liaison for this broadcast. She's going to be on our Twitter account, which is at Spark Freedom, and she will be just dialoguing with you throughout the whole thing. You can ask questions, and at the end of the broadcast, she will relay those questions to us. So just feel free to interact with her. Our Twitter handle is at Spark Freedom. And then finally, I would like to welcome Mike Taguchi from eResources. He's the Vice President over there, and he is our guest expert for today as we talk about digital security. So eResources is a company that provides digital strategies, and Mike's background specifically has been political communication and online advocacy, and he now works with a huge variety of companies, everything from think tanks to associations and education institutions as a part of eResources. Some of his security consultation includes work with places like Google and Stanford University, and then a huge network of free market nonprofits. So I just want to cover a couple of things before we get into this webinar, a couple of housekeeping things. First of all is we invited Mike to come on because he actually authored one of the chapters in the Spark Freedom Guide to Online Reputation Management, which was a free resource that we recently released earlier this summer. It's a resource for nonprofit groups to help them elevate their online reputation management, as the title says. And digital security was one of those chapters. So if you want to see that resource, you can find your free copy over at sparkfreedom.org/library, which we are planning on having a growing library of these kinds of resources. And secondly, I already mentioned that you can interact with us on Twitter. We're using the hashtag #SparkSecurity. So if you want to group the conversation together in one spot, just use that hashtag. And again, if you have questions that you want to ask either Mike or myself during the conversation, we will get to questions at the end of the broadcast, but you can ask them anytime on Twitter just using our handle and using the hashtag #SparkSecurity. And then finally, we are doing a giveaway. We're giving away 2 Amazon gift cards. So if you pay attention and are engaged throughout the entire broadcast, we're going to share 3 code words at different points in the broadcast. And if you write them down, don't share them with anybody else. Just keep them for yourself and then send them to us via direct message on Twitter if you want to @SparkFreedom, or you can email them to us at info@sparkfreedom.org. And of the people that submit those 3 code words to either of those platforms, we will be doing a random drawing and giving away 2 $25 Amazon gift cards. So, all right, that's the housekeeping. That we're all set up for success here on this broadcast now. Let's get into the topic that all of you are wanting to hear more about and that Mike is going to share. So Mike, to kick this off, can you just describe the current state of digital security? Give us a snapshot. Like, what are the biggest trends? What's going on in that world right now?
Sure, no problem, Lasse, and thanks for having me. It's really exciting to participate in one of these and get a chance to interact with everybody, so we're really excited for this.
Absolutely, thanks for being here.
Yeah, no doubt. So online security has always been something that I think folks knew was a really important topic, but now they're starting to see some real-world examples of why these protocols and why their sort of IT experts are suggesting that they really need to take these things seriously. You start seeing stories like Target or Home Depot having credit card data breached and released. You see celebrity folks that used cloud sharing platforms that had some pictures released that they didn't want to have. You see website hackers that are using cross-site scripting or denial of service attacks that lead to SQL injection or other security violations of websites that are either embarrassing to an organization or also could just disrupt the services of what they're trying to provide. So there's a lot of information and a lot of events that are occurring that folks are starting to see why when you look at both your personal security, the devices and things that you do in your everyday life, and how that melds into your work or your organization's overall security policy or plan, how we need to start really taking those things in a serious fashion and crafting a strategy, or doing an audit that allows people to find a good balance between practical realities of how the work and technology world is flowing, and how they need to keep those things secure.
So you mentioned things like denial of service, and you mentioned these breaches that happened at Home Depot and at Target. Without getting too technical, what kind of attacks are those? Like how are people invading security in those situations?
Yeah, and thinking of it in terms of how it affects the nonprofit or association world, everyone has to keep, everyone has streams of online revenue. They keep their information, like their donors or people who have purchased things or attended events, in databases. In those databases are hosted in server environments, and those are each level of those requires its own type of security. Meaning you have servers that need to have firewalls, or you have website code that needs to go through an audit to make sure that there aren't vulnerabilities for it, and you need to encrypt data to ensure that if you've collected credit card information for a donor, that it's not something that can be taken advantage of. And so those organizations, despite the fact that they have, these are groups that have millions of dollars of IT budgets, far outpacing what a smaller to mid-sized nonprofit might have, they still didn't have in place the necessary protections that they needed to ensure that that data wasn't breached. And so those types of things provide lessons for the rest of us, that groups that are out there with malicious intent, hackers, and folks that may just want to embarrass a group. They may not like your political agenda, and they want to get at your donor data or just hack your website. Those types of folks have they're sort of constantly evolving and mutating their tactics. There's no like magic bullet, like, oh, hey, go to this site and apply this software, or call this group and you can put a lock on the door type thing. So there's a lot of different mechanisms and manners in which they're doing attacks, and that's sort of, I think, why we've divided up these things into the different categories of places where you need to be thinking of security, both from an individual standpoint and then holistically as it relates to your entire network or all of your operations.
So one thing that I've always been kind of curious about, maybe since we're starting kind of with just the general description, is what is a hacker? I mean, people watch movies like The Matrix and they see people writing lines of code and that kind of stuff, but as I understand it now, I mean, hacking isn't necessarily like getting into somebody's computer and like rewriting things and changing everything. Like, what is the ultimate goal of a hacker?
Well, as an example, we worked with a very large, prominent Washington, D.C. think tank that the politics of their group was something that there were certain folks in international countries that they weren't appreciative of. I won't say the name of the organization, but
Sure.
The country that didn't like it were some people in China. And they were under sort of constant attack from groups that were using the internet to try and probe and poke and scan their network to try and find any vulnerabilities. And again, the types of things they wanted to do were to get at data, meaning like hack into a database and take all of the resources out of it. That could be just content, but it could be contacts, it could be credit card information if it's not stored in an appropriate way, social security numbers, and a lot of other important protected data. Or they could be looking just to make a name for themselves by taking down a website. Or defacing a website, that happens a lot, where folks who don't have secure enough code or secure enough system, they just have someone go in and they'll mark up a website, and then the hacker will announce it like, hey, look what we did to so and so's site. And so what a hacker is someone with an agenda that at multiple levels and within a technology infrastructure is looking to violate something that you've got in order to advance an agenda of their own.
And it goes beyond just a hacker being able to guess your password, right? There are other ways that they can probe the system and breach security. So you need to establish layers of security that go beyond just, hey, I have a password that has random letters and numbers with various capitalization in it, right?
Right, of course. And that's one part of it. It's obviously a small part, and I think we will get into later how the proliferation of smartphones and tablets and things like that have made, and just even laptops in general, and the way the world has become a more mobile office. Everybody's on the go, and it allows us to be more efficient and work from multiple places. But it also means that information that is typically your organizations or your companies that used to just reside on a computer or a server or a mainframe that was at your office is now essentially accessible from any place. You're at a coffee shop using Dropbox, or you're using a VPN to get into your server so that you can enjoy your day but also get some work done. Those are things that it means that if you're on your tablet and your tablet's not secure, or your laptop doesn't have the correct password configuration, then someone has the keys to the kingdom for your company. And so that's where a lot of the nonprofits that we've been working with have been trying to formulate what we would call an acceptable use policy, but just generally speaking, saying like, okay, well, the reality is our workers are now all over the place with all sorts of devices and all sorts of online connections to stuff that we consider to be mission critical information or data. How do we make sure that that stays safe in this environment?
Very cool. All right, well, like you said, we are going to get into areas where we're going to break down each kind of big silo of digital security and talk about a couple different aspects of that. But before we get to that, I want to share our first code word for the Amazon gift card drawing. And that first word, if you're on this broadcast, you want to jot down the word secure. S-E-C-U-R-E, secure. Okay. So, Mike, let's talk about each of the different silos. The first one being website and social media accounts. We kind of agreed to lump those together because they share a lot of similarities. Sure. So, first off, what kind of security threats are these kinds of things susceptible to?
I mean, that's where we started the conversation, in that almost obviously everyone has a web presence. Every company worth their salt has got something up there that they use as one of their primary marketing or communication tools. And so all of those websites are built based on designs and code, and those codes are things that if a group is trying to get at you, that they are able to look at. And that could be something that it doesn't matter if it's a proprietary code or an open source code that millions of people have looked at. They all have their different vulnerabilities. I think we saw with the Heartbleed issue earlier this year, there was a vulnerability in the OpenSSL that tons and tons of developers utilized, and that was something that was an obviously great real-world example of it doesn't matter how many people have audited a code or looked at something. There's still places that people will be able to mutate different kinds of hacks to get in through.
Before you go on, real quick, for the layman such as myself, can you describe the difference between a proprietary code and an open source code?
Sure. An open source code would be like PHP or Drupal. It's code that there's a group or set of developers. They've developed it. Any person could go through and look at it and say, and that has the benefit of the community sharing in it, so that they can all improve it and give ideas, and there's typically patches and things like that that go out. But then you also have obviously the issue where everyone gets to look at it, so it's easier for people to sort of game plan on how to take advantage of it. And also from a security standpoint, a lot of times you get patches and things like that that are sent out by the different code bases that you don't really know. You don't have a full detailed explanation of it. A proprietary system is one that's built by a developer, and it means that the code isn't shared. Typically, just the code is not shared. It's something that they try and protect it so that it could potentially be more secure that way, but it also means that it's less tested. So you also don't know whether or not there are vulnerabilities there either. And so those are typically, WordPress would be an example of something that's open source, in that you can go in and modify the code if you want to. It's all available to somebody. Drupal is another one. But when people think of proprietary, anything like even Microsoft Word is a proprietary software piece. So when thinking of websites, stuff like Expression Engine and Adobe, those are groups that have proprietary CMSs that you can go in and you can play around with certain parts of the code, but there are also elements that are not available to you. And so both have advantages and disadvantages from a security standpoint. Neither one, no one. This is essentially like the message: no one is really safe either way. There's not a recommendation a technology person could give you to say, this is what you have to do, and this will make sure that you're 100% secure.
Okay, so just because it's open source doesn't mean that you are insecure at all. Because I
Oh,
imagine when you first started talking about that, everybody's like, "Wait, I'm on WordPress. I'm in big
yeah,
trouble."
no, not at all, not at all. In fact, I mean, if it's probably a whole other session to just talk about the differences in security of platforms and things like that. WordPress is, very, very secure for what it's used for. But like I said, I think that any platform has the potential to be vulnerable in one way or another. It's great to have a community of coders that are constantly working to improve something. So there shouldn't be somebody out there who thinks open source equates to less secure.
All right, well, let's talk about like what kind of damage could people expect if their website or their social media accounts are compromised? What are they looking at dealing with?
I mean, since they're both, the reason we group them together is that typically they're managed by similar folks, and they're managed in a particular fashion, meaning there's usually like some online platform you're logging into and you're going in and making changes. The social media one, that tends to be more of the hacker trying to get at and humiliate, essentially. Like, hey, let me log into your Twitter account and say all sorts of ridiculous things. So there tends not to be like loss of data or things, as more of from a public relations standpoint, it can be worse. But the website, I think that's where you start, hitting on some of the real crucial things that organizations keep within, like I said, their databases and pieces. It's like I said, it's your primary presence, it's your primary communication tool. If you have someone who gets access to your web platform, or is able to, get into the code or upload something to the code, you can have loss of people's email addresses, all of the data of your contacts, that protected data we talked about. That's really the most important. The stuff that should be either encrypted or not kept at all, a credit card information, or a social security number. You could have people defacing pages on your website, or going through, and if you don't have some of the other parts of a security plan in place, like if you don't have the right backup or disaster recovery piece, someone goes into your server and deletes a lot of files, then you may have lost those files either permanently, or you're in the process of a really painful rebuild of things. And so all parts of your online infrastructure could be compromised from the web standpoint, and that's why it's important to, looking at the different types of protections that people need to have in place. They need to understand who are the people that have permission to access these things. Who are who's the developer or person that I'm working with? What type of security audits, what type of testing do they do on their side? What type of data are we actually keeping? I've worked with some nonprofits and think tanks that, again, also will not be named.
Sure.
Things like, hey, Mike, we did a fundraising event, and I've got a stack of credit card slips in my drawer that I just keep here. Those are the types of things that you'd be surprised how frequently, or, oh, I've got my credit card information, I run it manually, and it's in a spreadsheet. I just keep it in an Excel file on my computer. Now, those are more egregious examples of folks not taking the right security precautions or steps. But even people that are trying to do things the right way, they've talked through the process. It doesn't make everything 100% secure. So you always need to be on the lookout for each step of thinking about your website, the website infrastructure, the process by which you're doing your posting, what data you're saving, who are the people that are accessing and protecting it, what proactive steps are they taking, and all of those different levels. Because like I said, I think that the one thing we've learned is that people who are, the folks that are either, we just keep saying hackers, but folks that tend to be in that industry or subculture that may want to attack a site, they're always changing and learning and creating new ways to do things. So I've seen places that spent millions of dollars trying to protect against existing hacks or existing vulnerabilities, but something else new is always around the corner. And so the security industry itself has to be constantly changing and updating things. And so you need to be, groups need to be thinking about that proactively to make sure that they are also, sort of at the ready and, constantly making sure things are safe on their side too.
What happens in this silo that we're talking about? How do you respond? Like you said, you can never be 100% secure. or
Mm-hmm.
it's rare that you would be even 99.9% secure.
Sure.
So somebody hacks into your website, somebody hacks into your social media account, data's lost. What do you do?
Well, obviously there's two elements of that. One is the marketing and PR part. Like, how do you make sure that you've reached out to, it depends on what they've done too. Did they go in and they just posted some stuff that they didn't want to? Did they upload some files? I've seen benign hacks where people just wanted to prove that they could do it. They'll go into a server and like upload some exe files or something that you don't, Trojan horse type thing. So they just kind of want the credit for, like, hey, I hacked that website. But then there are other folks that are even more, nefarious in terms of what they're trying to accomplish. So your response is a little bit based on what actually happened. Sometimes you're just trying to do damage control for, like, hey, somebody posted a inappropriate picture on our website. But in other cases, you're doing things like contacting people who felt like their contributions to your organization were private. And they may not want their name out there or associated with it, and so you may be doing individual contact there. You're certainly, from an operational standpoint, immediately talking to your staff, whoever had access to it. You're changing passwords and fixing things that are out there. You're working with your web developer or whoever your IT support team is to make sure that whatever vulnerability was exposed is immediately fixed and taken care of. And so kind of have like a multifaceted approach, and you have to, your response is measured based on what actually happened within the breach.
All right, awesome. One of the next topic areas that we wanted to discuss was internal servers and backup drives. I guess my first question about this is this becoming less and less common? Are more people moving to the cloud? But for those that have those things in place, what kind of security threats are those susceptible to?
Well, yeah, you kind of have two different ways to look at this. One, there are still plenty of organizations that run their email in what we consider to be a more traditional fashion. They've got a Microsoft Exchange server or something along those lines that's in their office, and they've got a backup process that runs with it. And so you need to be protective of those in the ways that folks would tend to do any sort of physical security, making sure that where the office, where the servers are located, they're protected. You need to make sure that people have the appropriate password protocol. And I think that leads a little bit to what we had mentioned at the outset, which is that it used to be more that you did your email work, while you were at the office, and maybe you had a BlackBerry or something like that. And that was sort of the cutting edge. But obviously now we're 10, 15 years past that, and people are all over the place in terms of where they can access information. And so setting up sort of rules for how to protect a device individually for a person, whether it's a passcode for the phone, whether it's encrypting certain information, if people are able to get to their email via laptops and tablets like most folks can. Making sure that the server has the correct level of encryption for it as well, and from a backup standpoint, making sure that there's an easy recovery method for your IT team if something were to go wrong or there would be some sort of security problem there. As it relates to the cloud, I mean, that sort of presents its own set of problems, which is that you get the benefit of you have somebody else doing all of this work for you. They're essentially backing it up and saving it, and you feel like it's always accessible from many locations. And that's wonderful, but it also makes it, in some ways, if there is a violation, it's harder for you to know or control it. And so, things like Amazon S3, they've had small to mid-sized security issues, and they become like little blips and lines. But I mean, if anyone can get at data within those servers, that means that anything that you're storing up there or your backup policy is potentially at risk. And same thing with iCloud and all the other, Dropbox. I mean, Dropbox is such a popular thing amongst nonprofits or products like that, Box.net, places where everyone's doing file storage, and then those files, those have contracts in them. They have private, strategic memos and things like that groups are, they don't want to be exposed with them. They don't want them accessible to other people. And so coming up with a sort of protocol internally about how you're going to handle that access, and making sure you're even choosing the right vendors in terms of which ones, keeping on top of privacy notifications and how different groups are handling those things is it can be a challenge because the distributed work environment creates so many more variables that you have to deal with.
Overall, though, do you feel comfortable with where general security is at for a place like Amazon or for a place like Dropbox? I mean, are you seeing more groups shifting from kind of these internal servers and backup drives to putting their stuff on the cloud and feeling pretty good about it?
I would say sort of yes with a caveat. Yes, I feel good about. I know that companies like that have invested billions of dollars in technology and to try and provide services that are extremely helpful and make people more productive. I feel like those aren't fly-by-night type operations, obviously. So feel good there. And in terms of organizations moving and shifting there, I think that there is definitely a natural progression that has been occurring. It seems like it's fairly standard for groups to use a Dropbox or to use Amazon for hosting or other cloud-based services. That said, I don't know that necessarily groups have done the best job of understanding the ramifications of that. In a bunch of different ways. I mean, one obviously I think is this crossover between personal and business. I think that's a difficult one. Where you find people's Dropbox is like, hey, look, here's my important strategic memo mixed with pictures of my kid's ballet recital.
Yeah.
And so,
well, at least Dropbox addressed that recently. Now they split it out, right?
So, right. They split it out, and this is it. Groups like Dropbox are constantly saying like, okay, what are the challenges that are being presented from a security standpoint? What types of solutions can we put in place to try and help our users? But again, that presumes that the people, your clients or your folks are actually handling things in the way that they suggest.
Sure.
So I mean, I think that how people interact with those products from a personal level and business level is an issue, and then also just overall understanding what it means to be in the cloud or having all of your things hosted in Amazon. If there's an outage, what does that mean? If there's a breach, what does that mean? And what is safe to store and where? I think the groups could do a much better job thinking both holistically about their strategy, but then also, within drilling down from a person-to-person or department level, saying like, this is how we're handling, this is what we do with our laptops that we hand out, or if you're on the road, this is how you need to log into certain things. Like, don't go to a coffee shop and leave, use the free Wi-Fi and be in our network. Types of things like that are, they're harder policies to create and to enforce.
Well, specifically that example, using public Wi-Fi when you're accessing something secure like your company's Dropbox. Can you maybe just elaborate on why that would be an issue specifically?
Well, obviously, if a Wi-Fi connection is open, then it would not be difficult for somebody in proximity to you to get into your device. And if they are into your device, then they can very easily get into the network that you're connected to. And so, that's an example that it was really scary 5 to 7 years ago when public Wi-Fi started to become more prominent. I think people are smarter about it now, but again, there's also more places that people are sharing types of things. Going back to our Dropbox example, there was less file sharing of sensitive information that way. Now every web platform is essentially a browser-based thing. So if you're on some sort of free Wi-Fi and you log into your WordPress site or any website at all, you could easily give up the password information there, and that sort of leads into what kind of passwords do you have? How do you have that security set up? What kind of permissions do you have? And so, there's a lot of cascading effects that can occur with that sort of setup.
Okay, cool. One other thing that we wanted to address was just, and you've already kind of touched on it a little bit, but just email and employee computers, laptops, phones, kind of the technology side of things. And forgive me if we're going to rehash a little bit of it, but I think it's good to bring it up. Just what kind of security threats are those things specifically susceptible to?
Well, sure. I mean, and one way for an organization, if you're a small to mid-sized nonprofit looking at what you want to do from a security standpoint on those types of devices, some of it is going to be based on your culture. I mean, there's no right answer on these things. But do you let your employees purchase their own devices? Like, does a group does everybody own their own phone, but have a company plan? Do you distribute the phones and force people to set up certain passwords? From a laptop standpoint, do you standardize it, or is it Mike's got the MacBook Air and Lasse's got the the new Dell PC, and everyone's got something different. So from an IT standpoint, like if you're looking at it from a security audit, do you have consistency across your organization? And you don't have to. I mean, we don't have to be drones and everybody has the same phone and same laptop. But you do need to have rules and procedures in place to make sure that, like, okay, if Mike's in the office all day, that's fine. But does he need to secure his laptop when he leaves? Add a lock to it, or make sure that there's physical security even.
Mm-hmm.
Who is guarding the door? Is the door locked? If Lass is on the road for 2 weeks, what are the does he have his own Wi-Fi that's secure in terms of connecting to the internet? Does he even when you boot up your computer, does it force you to put a password in each time? Or are you connecting via a VPN? Are you doing everything in an online email piece? And so thinking about hardware device and all of the devices you have, I think an organization has to start kind of from a top-down standpoint and say, like, what is our culture? What do our people have? Like, what are we willing to provide? And then what measures will make the most sense to make us balance both being able to get work done and have our employees be happy, but also make sure that we've secured the things that are critical. Because some of these things can be annoying things to have in place, annoying practices. But if you have a situation where your donor data gets out, I mean, it won't matter. It's not, you won't be thinking, man, I can't believe I have to type in this punch code each time. You'll be freaking out in such a way that obviously, like, things are at stake that are bigger than your convenience. So, I mean, I think that groups should look at their hardware and equipment in terms of both their culture, their security protocol overall, and then just also physical security. I think that that's the type of thing that it's a hard thing for groups to implement because of distributed environments and diversity of devices. And so I'd recommend strongly that you work with your IT team to make sure that you work with your management team about how you're going to filter out the policy to groups, and you work with your IT team to come up with something that works for everybody.
Cool. All right, well, before we jump into the next segment, I want to share that second code word with our audience so that you guys can get your chance at one of our 2 Amazon gift cards. And that second code word is the word yourself. Yourself. Okay. Mike, on this next segment, we covered a couple of the topics already, so I'm going to just skip ahead a little bit and dive into something. I want to just talk, we already talked about backup a little bit, but I just wanted to ask, what kind of backup system should nonprofits have in place? So in case that they're hacked, or if their server has a fire in it or whatever, so that they can restore any data that they were lost. What are some of your specific recommendations for a backup system, either cloud or physical?
Well, if your server has a fire in it, I think you may have other issues occurring that deal. But seriously, kind of addressing those things. With backup, there's a couple of other things that you want to look at. You also want to look at what we would term as disaster recovery. You kind of have those 2 things go hand in hand. Disaster recovery we consider to be sort of a crazed act of God type event. We usually talk about where we host some of our servers in a data center it's near Washington D.C., but it's what we consider to be outside the blast radius. And but you think of things in terms of, like, what happens if there is a catastrophic event? My office burns down. The data center is fully compromised. What do we do? And those types of things, there's a lot of different examples of what you could have. You could have redundant data in multiple geographic locations. You could have a backup, essentially a website that you could activate that exists in some other server or rack or place, and that's something that you would want to work with a web developer on to say, like, hey, if my server is hosted in Rackspace and Rackspace is destroyed for some reason or another, what happens? What do we do? Or if there's some massive hack or some security breach, what do we do in those cases? And in a lot of situations, you would want to have the ability to quickly spin up an alternate version of the website in a different location. So I mean that's one strategy from a web standpoint that would deal with disaster recovery directly. As far as your more day-to-day backup, what we typically recommend is that you have something that's running on at least a 24-hour cycle, meaning once every 24 hours it's collecting data from the website if you've made changes, added press releases, or however, depending on what your organization's content strategy is. You're doing something once on a daily basis that you can access for a period of a week to 2 weeks, would sort of be one standard way of doing it. And then you have a global backup that happens, every week or every month, or you can pick the interval depending on how often. Depends on how much content you're generating or how frequently your site changes. And the global backup would be something that does, one big dump of all of the files, and you may take that again to another geographic location so that there's a backup of those things. So you've got a daily backup, and then you have a consistent backup policy that would give you a sort of a master file. When you're talking about cloud-based stuff, now that was sort of server-based backups that I was talking about. When you're talking about cloud-based things, most of them have backup options available, and it depends on if you're talking about an iCloud or an Amazon or Dropbox or any of the things like that. They have different online backup protocols that you can either purchase as part of the service or you can set it up on your own to manually run it. For example, we have a number of sites that run off, websites that run off cloud-based servers, but we do an individual sort of backup for the group and then take those files outside of the cloud so that there's always something that we could default back to should something happen to the Amazon, Amazon's environment. But again, those are the types of things that are specific to particular organizations and what their need is to be, up immediately, what their response time is, like what type of data they're housing. And so I think that another thing you want to look at, again, tying it back to how people's day-to-day lives actually affect their use of technology for their business, is what kind of personal backups do you have? If you're doing if you have people who are not consistently uploading everything to a server environment or to Dropbox or a cloud-based thing, do you have all of their information backed up from their laptop or from their tablet or whatever a device that they're utilizing to do company work on? Do they have a storage drive that they can use? What are the restrictions or rules on that storage drive? And so I think those get into that acceptable use policy and what you require of your employees, and something that is, I think you have to just mandate, from the top and say, this is how we're going to do it. We want you to upload everything to X place, or we want you to use this backup system. And though it may be a mild inconvenience, that pales in comparison to what happens if you don't have that data either stored or saved.
Right, right. All right, well, let's talk a little bit about something that has to be addressed with every conversation about digital security, and that's anti-spam and antivirus. So I know that in some instances people feel like this stuff, the cure is almost as bad as the disease, right? Can you talk just a little bit about these systems and what people should kind of expect and look for?
Yeah, and antivirus and anti-spam, I mean, really dividing them into two categories. With antivirus, you're talking about, using it on your personal computer. It's annoying. It runs a scan. It slows things down. You get those annoying pop-ups and things like that. But if you're talking about, and within the free market community, you have a lot of groups that are, or even in just the nonprofit world in general, you have a lot of groups that this isn't a 50,000 person company, or it's not a global group. You have QuickBooks on people's computers, that they run their accounting or do their payroll through. You have a lot of information that is available that if you open or browse a file that you shouldn't be touching, or you just even accidentally, you could lose valuable information or data or have stuff exposed that you don't want. And so I know that it's from a day-to-day basis, it's annoying to have to run it, but every IT person worth their salt would say we need to find an antivirus solution. Try and make it as not an obtrusive thing that ruins your day, but something that can run in the evening, something that they can run from an automated or remote standpoint. And again, it gets back to just making sure, like, every culture is going to be different, every group is going to have different ways that they operate from a business standpoint. They should be working with the folks that constitute either their security experts, their IT folks, their operations people. You can come up with a plan that allows your devices to have antivirus on them without, being the most annoying thing that ever encounters. Like you said, the cure being worse than the actual disease. And so it's not something that you should say, well, I'd rather just not deal with it. You need to have it in place at the computer level or the device level, but you also need to have it on the server level. There are a lot of organizations that have sites hosted on web servers that may not have the appropriate level of protection for antiviruses, and that's a way that, whether it's that cross-site scripting that I was talking about, or files being uploaded maliciously, those are things that if you're trying to cut costs and you're like, well, hey, I figured out that I can host my website on X place for this inexpensive amount, that can come back to bite you. So when you're investigating your hosting options, you need to be looking into, like, well, okay, what kind of firewalls are available with these servers? Are there switches that route traffic back and forth, or load balancers that route traffic back and forth? If one server goes down, is there a new server that can spin up, or can my traffic be shifted someplace else? So, I mean, you need to have antivirus protection on the servers, but you also need to be thinking in terms of, like, what happens if something goes wrong within that server environment. And so it's specific to antivirus, but it's also, from a broader standpoint, thinking about hosting environments and configuring them, that people need to take, note of how the environment is configured can really affect how secure it is.
Okay. Unless you have a Mac, right? Then you just don't need antivirus at all.
Yeah, you're right. I've got a Mac, and they never send me little notifications that say install update patch. I'm sure that's not related to security in any way. So.
All right. Well, then what about anti-spam? You'd mentioned that was a different topic.
Anti-spam is it's a real challenge, because there are things that people. You feel like email it should be secure in a certain fashion, but you don't want emails from, the prince of so-and-so that wants you to get your bank account information, or really just, the annoyance of having to go through and delete stuff on a day. I probably get 75 to 100 spam messages a day, and I feel like we've got a pretty good anti-spam solution in place. So, I know there are probably groups that deal with even more, and it's a headache, it's an annoyance, it slows you down, it makes you less productive. But you need to find a balance of finding the different kinds of tools and available resources that work with depends on what your email client is. There's people who use Google Mail, there are people that will use an exchange-based mail. There's a lot of different email solutions, and so what is the best spam solution or anti-spam solution tends to be specific to that particular email program. One of the things that you run into, you have issues with spoofing. Like, people will get a message that looks like it's from themselves, or
right.
Anyone who's had a Yahoo account has probably sent out messages to their contact list that's like, click this link here for a great 24-hour drug something or other. It's there's a lot of pieces of that are just a real frustration. And one of the things that is a negative consequence, or sort of an unexpected consequence of having an anti-spam solution, is that sometimes you could lose some of the legitimate messages that you want to make sure are coming through. So you have to work very closely with your IT folks to make sure that you've calibrated things in such a way that, like, you've tightened it to avoid, particular kinds of messages you don't want, but you also have not set it up in such a way that it's so stringent that you missed an email from an important contact or a meeting request or something like that. Because I see that a lot with folks that are like, well, what happened to this message? It's like, well, you blocked these 500 keywords, and one of them was in the subject line, and so that person's message got dumped into your spam folder.
Right.
And so you need to come up with you need to have a solution, obviously the same way with antivirus. You need to have an anti-spam solution in place. You need to have one that's customized based on what your email client is. And then you need to work with your IT provider to come up with the best balance in terms of flow of information and getting what you want, but also filtering out the things that are unnecessary. And so if you have somebody who's aggressively and proactively looking at that, it's never going to be perfect. You can't avoid spam, but you can reduce it to a point where it's less of a hassle.
So do you have, thinking about this topic in general, digital security,
Hmm.
Do you have an estimate on what a company should reasonably expect to spend? A nonprofit, the size of the general size in the network that we work with, anywhere between 10 and 50 employees maybe, what they should plan on spending maybe in time and in money on digital security.
Well, I mean, I think that I've seen a very broad range. I mean,
Okay,
I know that there are some groups that have that invest as little as possible in it,
sure.
and sometimes that works. Sometimes you skate by, but it's
It's
obviously
all about leveraging risk,
it's
right?
all about leveraging risk. And then there are other groups who invest extremely heavily, that they will spend, thousands of dollars a month, depending on what it is that they're trying to protect. And so, I mean, the way we recommend doing it is, regardless of who you are, whether you're a two-person, firm working out of your mom's basement, or whether you're a, 50-person group with a, large, beautiful office and suite, you want to take your operations or management team, your IT team, and you want to work with your whoever it is from a web standpoint or from a security standpoint and audit things. And you want to do that audit on a yearly basis at a minimum. And those types of things can be as inexpensive as $1,000 or $2,000. They can be more depending on how large your infrastructure is. Obviously, your costs are going to multiply depending on if you are a 35-person organization with 75 devices and two big websites and a 1,000-person database of donors, you're going to spend more money than a group that is a 2 or 3-person shop that has more control over all of the individual things. And that's what I was talking about earlier. I think that security policies, though there are some best practices that everyone needs to follow, a lot of stuff is going to be based on your culture or your individual, what you do with a WordPress site versus a Salesforce CRM versus a tablet, all these different things. You want to come up with something that works for you and follows the advice of folks. So you want to do an audit on an annual basis. You want to make sure that you divide these categories up and say, like, okay, who is it that manages our website on our organization side, and is there an outside party? Or usually there's an outside party or vendor, or you have an internal resource that does it. What are we doing in terms of sort of ongoing maintenance and security? Do we scan things on a quarterly basis? Do we keep up with trends or problems? Are we contacting other organizations to understand where their potential security risks are? And what's most important to us? Is it protecting our donor data? Probably should be. Is it protecting our contacts or private strategic conversations and things? Is it backing up our email? So I mean, how you end up budgeting for these things when you're talking about everything from your website to your physical security to your devices and infrastructure to your email and anti-spam, I mean, that crosses over to huge swaths of your organization. So people shouldn't necessarily think of it as like, oh man, I gotta, it's an IT person saying I should spend more money on IT stuff. It's really looking at it in terms of individual departments and the activities that those things cover, because the security policy cuts across all of those different operations. And so you want to look at it from that overarching like umbrella, like what is our organization's security plan and policies, but also just breaking it down individually, because some of them don't necessarily overlap in the same ways.
Sure.
You need to make sure that you've identified and addressed them on a case-by-case basis. If you may have a server in your office that stores all the files, or you may use Dropbox or some other cloud-based thing. So how much you spend there tends to be a result of what the actual solution is that's in place. Same thing for a website. You may say, well, we just have a brochure-style site that's up, and it's running off so-and-so platform, and we feel good about that. Or you may have something that's got a huge database attached to it, or integrates with your CRM or something like that.
Sure.
And you may feel like the security in that level is much more critical to address or be more proactive on. So I think that an individualized plan that melds the best practices along with things that fit the culture are the way that we like to approach things from our perspective. But sometimes it's hard. I mean, a lot of times you have websites within the marketing and communication department, and then you have the IT folks that get locked in a closet somewhere. And then you have operations, and COOs that deal with the finances and stuff. Getting them to sort of communicate at the level that touches on all of these things and comes up with something that is cohesive and makes sense can be a challenge.
Yeah. Well, so what are some additional resources? I mean, we've talked about a lot of different topics during this conversation. You've given us some really great info. If people want to dive in a little bit more and learn more, what are some things that you recommend they look at?
There are a lot of good online resources and things like that, but they tend to cover topics at a more generic level. If you have folks who are just interested in like, hey, I don't really know that much about online security, they could go into, there's some white papers that we could provide to them, send out a list of links, or give to you. We could also send out some websites, whether it's just general technology stuff, even something as simple as like Mashable or TechCrunch that covers some some of the hot topics. But you can also dive deeper into things based on the silo that you're looking at. Someone might say, like, I'm really concerned about my website security, or I'm really concerned about file sharing. There's a lot of different, those types of places, because they tend to be, sort of separate issues. They get covered in different areas. And so we have online resources available. We also have a lot of groups that we've either partnered with, or even our group ourselves, that loves to do security consultation, whether it's something as formalized as an audit or just something in terms of giving advice. And that's an important piece, at least from my perspective, because eResources has been working within the think tank community for more than a decade, and from our standpoint, we understand that there are groups that are out there of huge varying sizes and shapes, and some of you have your own internal resources, and some of you work with different partners that are local to you, and some of you work with us. And from our standpoint, we just want to make sure that you're like you said, following the best practices and have something that is in place. So we're always happy to act as a resource and give you advice on that front. If you say this is one issue that we're particularly concerned about, antivirus or a backup, and point you in the right direction, or help work with the group that is your partner to make sure that you're on the right track in terms of it. And so I think there's a plethora of resources in terms of just reading up and understanding some of the issues more deeply. There are some sample security protocol things that we've developed for different SPN groups that we would be happy to provide in terms of this is what an acceptable use policy might look like. This is what kind of physical security you might want to do. But then also, there are groups both across the country that are, that specialize in the different types of security practices that need to be implemented or executed at the company level.
And if people want to follow up with you regarding the services you provide, the resources you mentioned, how can they get in touch?
Sure. My email address is mike@eresources.com. It's just eresources, all one word. Or on Twitter, it's mtaguchi12. You can find me on Facebook, or my phone number is 703-855-7160. That's my direct work line. Okay. So if you guys have any questions, email's best. I'm one of those people that's attached at the hip and always always checking it. So if you have questions, happy to chat, happy to direct you to folks on our IT team that may have specific knowledge on an issue you're trying to work through. We'll also be at the annual meeting in a couple of weeks if you want to find me and grab a drink and just chit-chat. But like I said, it's important for us to act as a resource to folks that we want to help advance their mission, because we know that security stuff it can be painful to implement. It's just it can be an additional cost that you're always trying to be as efficient with your budget as you can. But we want to make sure that we help you take the precautions that you need on all of these different fronts.
Great. Well, so we have just a few minutes left. So I know, Sarah, you've been monitoring Twitter, that you've been interacting with our audience members. So I want to kick it over to you for a couple of questions. We want to try to wrap up by 11, though. So let's try to keep the answers brief, Mike.
Okay. Brevity is not my strength.
No, it's fine. I want to be respectful of our audience members' time. So.
Gotcha.
All right, let's see. We have this question right here. Talk about firewalls. How secure is a firewall by itself, and how often should passwords be changed?
Okay. Firewalls are very secure, but they are not something that just because you have a firewall doesn't mean that your server environment is fully protected. There's a lot of other pieces of the configuration and the environment in general that need to be put in place. So a firewall is a good first step. Or if you had a website hosted that did not have a firewall, or you didn't have a firewall protecting some of your other hardware or infrastructure, that would be a problem. but it's not something that a COO or CEO should be like, oh, I had the IT people install a firewall. Don't worry, we're good. It's just it's a part. It'd be like, thinking of it from an equipment standpoint. It'd be like saying, like, I got my helmet on, but I lost all the other pads. Am I still okay? So yeah, a firewall by itself is a great place to start for a lot of protection, but it isn't something that is the end all be all. It doesn't do everything for you.
Okay.
From a password standpoint, and we didn't really, this is one that it is hard for me to be real short on. The way you should handle the recommended way, I think, to handle passwords is I like to use a password manager that helps unlock all of the passwords. You shouldn't be using the same password for everything. Like, it doesn't matter if it's like 9 capital letters, 7 symbols, and 14 characters. If you use the same password for everything, if it gets hacked in one place, and that could be something as innocuous as, it could be Facebook, it could be like, Target or Home Depot or one of those groups that we mentioned. Your password gets stored in a lot of different places, or it gets stored in your browser someplace. If you use the same one or very similar ones, and one gets accessed, then all of those things could be taken down. And so you want to not use the same one all the time. You want to make sure that you have. I don't say changing it like on a monthly basis is necessary, but you want to be changing things at least every, I would say on a quarterly basis is something that I would recommend. But
Okay.
amongst the number of accounts that people have these days, that's a Herculean task to go through and change every password. And that's why, this is, if people had a question about this, I'd be happy to give them a number of recommendations. There are programs out there to help you that essentially provide authentication keys to help you, unlock your password essentially on a site-by-site basis, and that helps keep things more secure. And it also takes out some of the stress of, what I don't remember my password for this one was, was this one gold 97 versus green 52 or anything like that.
Those are your bank account passwords, right?
Exactly. So yeah, I think that changing things on a quarterly basis is what we would recommend. You can do it more frequently, but a lot of it has to do with like which accounts we're talking about, how accessible are they, what's stored in them, and I think that people need to look at different options for helping manage the password. Don't write them down on like a notepad and keep it in your drawer. Don't keep them in a spreadsheet that is not encrypted. Well, don't keep them in a spreadsheet, period. But those are the types of things I've seen people do. They're like, well, yeah, I keep track of it all this way, and so that's another physical security risk that people need to think about.
All right. Let's see. Let me get to one other one. Do nonprofits need a full-time employee to handle digital security, or is there a viable third-party alternative?
I don't think that you need a full-time security person. You don't even necessarily need a full-time IT person. Again, it depends on your organization's needs, how you're handling your digital strategy and stuff like that. From our standpoint, we would be an example of a third party that could do things like a security audit, just to come in and have somebody go to your operations and say, let's look at things from a physical standpoint. What do you have locked down? What's your web hosting environment like? What's your website code like? What is your employee policy like? So I think that if you can do those types of things with many organizations. Ours is an example, but there are plenty that we could recommend as well that give you the opportunity to get important data and then formulate a plan that you can execute. You don't have to have a full-time staff member to do it. Now, again, if we had more time, I'd dive down into like how that might work from a website vendor standpoint, how it might work from a IT security standpoint or data standpoint. But I think the answer is no. You don't have to have somebody full-time, but again, whether or not you want to have somebody full-time sort of depends on your budget and what your needs are.
Right. So if that question actually came from Don. So if Don has some follow-up questions for you, he can just get up with you via email or your Twitter or phone. Right.
Yeah. I'd strongly recommend starting at a conversation and an audit, and then that should lead to recommendations like, here's some immediate, urgent issues that need to be addressed. Here are some things to be aware of, and then here are some potential recommendations that may or may not fit with what you're looking at, and then that helps the organization come up with a plan to move forward. But yeah, anybody that's got a question like that, if you're not sure where your nonprofit or where your organization is in the process, just touch base with me by email. I'm happy to do a quick call and chat through some of the different options and who might be a good person to talk to.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you, Sarah, for relaying those questions over. I want to share that final code word with everybody for our Amazon gift card drawing, and that final code word is digitally. The final word is digitally, so you can send that to Sarah on Twitter via direct message, or you can email the 3 code words to info@sparkfreedom.org. Mike, I want to thank you for being on this call and sharing all your wisdom on digital security with us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And for all of you who are watching, you can download a copy of our online reputation management guide, of which Mike wrote one of the chapters, at sparkfreedom.org/library. And you should also look for us and resources at the SPN annual meeting coming up in late September. We're going to have a booth there where you can play games like Giant and Jenga and Beanbag Toss. You can win tons of different premium items. And then we're also hosting a communications reception on Thursday night where we're going to have drinks and food, and we are going to share the winners of our Trendsetter Awards. Mm-hmm. So you'll want to make sure to check us out there. And we'll also be doing another Spark session next month, so be sure to stay tuned to us for that. And that's it for today. So again, thank you, Mike. Thank you, Sarah. Have a great day, everyone.
See ya.